The viral growth of the Occupy movement and the public support of it is testament to the tremendous dissatisfaction with the inequities and abuses of corporate capitalism. The slogan, "We are the 99%, is resonating with many people. What is your view of the potential strength of this type of mass protest and its possibility to affect social change?
Well, the Occupy movement already has had a number of significant successes. One of them, as you say, is to kind of change the national discourse. These concerns and fears and so on were, of course, prevalent for a long time for perfectly objective reasons, having to do with changes in the socioeconomic system in the last 30 or 40 years. But they weren't crystallized very clearly until the Occupy movement put them forward. And now they're kind of common coin. So 99% and 1%, the radical equality, the farcical character of purchased elections, the corporate shenanigans that led to the current crisis and have been crushing people for a long time, the overseas wars and so on. What are that's one major contribution. The other one is not discussed so much, but I think it's pretty important. This is an extremely atomized society. People are alone. It's a very business-run society, and the very explicit goal of the business world is to create a social order in which the basic social unit is you and your television set, in which you're watching ads and going out to purchase commodities. And there's tremendous efforts made to, it's going on for a century and a half, to try to induce this kind of consciousness and social order. In fact, if you go back, say, 150 years, the early days of the Industrial Revolution, right here in Massachusetts, where it started, there was very lively press at the time, probably the period of the greatest free press in the United States. All kinds of press, ethnic, labor, anything. And the labor press, which was extremely interesting and lively and participatory, had a great many harsh criticisms of the industrial system that was being imposed, into which people were being driven. But one of the core criticisms was what 150 years ago they called the new spirit of the age. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self, which they considered, savage and inhuman, and it was being driven into their heads. Well, 150 years later, they're still trying to drive it into people's heads. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self, and now it's considered a kind of an ideal, but it's also intolerable to human beings. One effect of the Occupy movement has been simply to spontaneously create small social systems of solidarity, mutual support, cooperation, cooperative kitchens, libraries, health services, general assemblies in which people actually interact and so on. That's something very much missing in the society. And when we talk about potential, part of the potential would be to, first of all, maintain those bonds and associations after the tactic has outlived its usefulness, and tactics do outlive their usefulness. But after that happens, if what has been learned and internalized can be sustained and extended, that would be very important in itself. The other dimension is how much can you engage the rest of the so-called 99% in these activities, concerns, interactions, and so on. That's the next big step that has to be taken.
Many in the Occupy movement have realized that political democracy is controlled by big money. Few, however, have expressed that economic democracy is essential for a truly democratic society. The progressive utilization theory, or PROUD, advocates economic democracy to empower people and communities through cooperative management of most enterprises. Economic democracy requires that the minimum requirements of life be guaranteed to everyone, and decision-making be decentralized so people have the right to choose how their local economies are run. It's the responsibility of all levels of government to promote policies that achieve full employment. Do you think that economic democracy and local economies could move us forward?
Well, first of all, this is the traditional stand of the left. So if you go back again 150 years ago to these same newspapers I was mentioning, one of their demands was that those who work in the mills should own them and, of course, manage them. That was the slogan of the Knights of Labor, the major, huge labor organization that developed in the 19th century. European socialism was mostly, had several branches, but the more left branches, if you like, were essentially the same, committed to workers' councils, community organizations, guild socialism in England was the same. This is the traditional thrust of the socialist movement. It's not understood here because, as I said again, this is a very business-run society. You're not allowed to know any of these things. So socialism is some kind of bad word, Well, okay, that's what happens in a highly controlled society, a highly indoctrinated society. But these are very familiar goals. And yes, in fact, you can go to the leading social philosopher in the United States, who everyone recognizes, is John Dewey, who just took this for granted. As he put it, unless every institution in society, industry, farming, communications, media, all of them, unless they're under popular democratic control by participation by the workforce and the community, he said, politics will just be the shadow cast over society by big business. That's the alternative. You can't have meaningful political democracy without functioning economic democracy. And I think this is, at some level, understood by working people. It has to be brought to awareness and consciousness, but it's just below the surface. And in fact, things are happening. So some of the most interesting are around in Ohio, around the Cleveland area, Cleveland Project. There's a dozen, maybe hundreds of not huge, but significant enterprises that are worker-owned, worker-managed. In some places there are, the biggest worker-owned collection of conglomerate is Mondragon in the Basque Country. That's worker-owned, but not worker-managed. And it's, industries, banks, schools, communities, very broad configuration. And there are various other elements of it here and there. A couple of quite good books have just come out about it. One by Gar Alperovitz, America Beyond Capitalism, which is about the worker-owned enterprises that are sprouting around the country. And this could go much beyond. So, for example, just look at about a couple of years ago, the government effectively nationalized the auto industry, came pretty close to it. And there were a couple of choices. One choice, which is the choice that's reflexive in a business-run system, is to reconstitute it, hand it back to the original owners or people very much like them and let them pursue the same course they were pursuing before. It's one possibility. That was, of course, the choice that was undertaken without discussion. But there was another choice. And if there had been a live, functioning Occupy movement at the time, it could have put that other choice onto the national agenda. It'd have to be much more larger and more organized than it is now, but this is only a few months after all. The other choice was to hand the auto industry over to the workers in the community and have them own and manage and run it, and have it directed to things that the country needs. There are, after all, things that we very badly need as a society. One of the most obvious is high-speed rail. The United States is just off the international spectrum in this respect. And it's a kind of a scandal. It's economically harmful, and socially harmful, just humanly harmful.
Ecologically harmful.
Ecologically harmful. I mean, everything you can think of. It's just ridiculous. And the skilled workforce in the, what's called the Rust Belt, could easily be reconfigured to do that. So people like Seymour Melman have been arguing about that, arguing for that for years. It might take some kind of federal aid, but nothing like what was, say, poured into the banks. And to make this even more ironic, at the very time that Obama was reconstituting the auto industry and handing it back to normal ownership, he was also sending his transportation secretary to Spain to get contracts for high-speed rail from the Spanish, who are way more advanced than we are, or the French or the Germans. And here you have this industrial system sitting there, workers wanting to work, communities wanting to have their own lively work-based communities, and the country needing things badly, but they can't be put together. That's quite a, we have to go somewhere else, like to Spain, to get them to help us out. I mean, it's an incredible condemnation of the semi-functioning system. And that's the kind of thing that an Occupy movement, when it moves beyond this particular tactic, should be addressing. And things like that are happening all over the country. There was one right here about 2 years ago, a small but a sophisticated manufacturing enterprise, pretty successful in one of the Boston suburbs, was producing specialized equipment for aircraft. I don't remember what it was. And the multinational that owned it wanted to shut it down, maybe not making enough profit for them or something. The union, UE, pretty progressive union, and the workforce offered to buy it and run it themselves with community support. Well, the company wouldn't agree. I suspect they lost money on it, but the problem, I don't know, but I suspect just for class reasons, the idea of a worker-owned, worker-managed successful enterprise is not appealing. Whatever the reasons, they closed it down. And so now that town doesn't have the industry in which it's partly based. Well, you know, again, with a live, progressive, activist movement that reached out to many parts of the community, that could have been salvaged. And there are things like that all over. So yes, it's the right thing to do. It's deeply ingrained in the American tradition, and it's been suppressed by the nature of a highly class-conscious business class, which is always, without stop, fighting a bitter class war. They know exactly what they're doing. It's very coordinated and controlled, and it's, I mean, it's true everywhere, but it's especially so in the United States. Happens to be unusual in this respect. We see many consequences of it.
Let's go on about the 1%. Because the physical resources of the planet are limited, the hoarding of wealth, or using it for speculation rather than productive investment, reduces the opportunities for other people and causes poverty. A fundamental principle of Prout is to limit the accumulation of wealth and create a maximum salary that's tied to the minimum wage, just as all the salaries in all the forms of government of the United States have pay scales, where the starting salary is no more than 10 times what the highest pay scale is for a president or a general or a president or a judge. So what is your opinion about limiting the accumulation of wealth?
Well, First of all, there are much more far-reaching goals than that. So another traditional ideal of the left movements has been from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And actually that's a pretty popular idea. There was in 1976, on the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, there were polls taken asking people, what do you think is it? Giving them lists of kind of statements, and they were supposed to judge which ones do you think are in the Constitution. Well, nobody knows what's in the Constitution, so the question that they're answering is which ones are obvious truisms. So they must be in the Constitution. This one got a considerable majority. I think people think, yeah, that makes sense. The pay scale issue is it's one reflection of, first of all, a lot of it has to do with financialization of the economy. This is a new phenomenon. I mean, of course, there's always been finance. There's always been, the financial crashes and so on. But there was a big change in the 1970s. The New Deal had instituted an array of regulations, among which were regulations which essentially determined that banks were banks. That is, they were to do what a bank is supposed to do in a state capitalist economy. You can argue that it's the wrong kind of economy. I would, for example. I suppose you would. But in that kind of economy, banks have a function. They're supposed to take unused capital, somebody's bank account, and transmit it to some kind of productive action, like starting a business or buying a house or whatever it may be. And they more or less did that. There were no crashes in the 50s and the 60s, the biggest growth period in American history, also a period of extremely, by our standards, current standards, very high taxation of the wealthy, very fast growth, egalitarian growth, no crashes. Well, that changed in the 70s and accelerated under Reagan. And there was, with a freeing up of constraints on capital. So the currencies had been more or less regulated. They were freed. The other constraints on capital were dropped. So you had a huge explosion of speculative capital, just kind of overwhelmed capital markets. By 2007, right before the latest crash, and the next one will come later, is financial institutions had about 40% of corporate profits. And they weren't helping the economy. In fact, one of maybe the most respected financial correspondent in the world is, at least the English-speaking world, is Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. He simply describes these institutions as like larvas that attach to a host and eat it away from the inside. The host that he's talking about is the market system, which of course he approves of. He says they're just eating it away from the inside, cites figures showing how harmful they are. But they do accumulate a lot of capital in very few hands. And that's one of the reasons that led to the pretty sharp concentration of income. The 1% image is a little misleading because it's really 1/10 of 1% that's where you find the enormous concentration of wealth. You go down below in the 1%, and they're wealthy, but not by spectacular standards. So yes, it concentrated wealth in a tiny percentage of the society. Substantially hedge fund managers, CEOs of financial corporations, and so on. And that translates itself almost reflexively into political power. You also had at the same time, in parallel, the sharp rise in spending for elections. So, of course, by now it's just totally out of sight. It's right on the front pages. But by the early 80s, it was already substantially increasing. That compels the parties to dig into corporate profits. And people say unions and corporations, but it's essentially corporations. That's where the money is. And increasingly financial corporations, so they increasingly essentially buy the elections. They also buy Congress in many ways. So, for example, I suppose the United States is the only parliamentary system where, and very recently, incidentally, it wasn't true before, where to get a position of some influence in Congress, say, a chair of a committee, which used to accrue to seniority and service in some fashion. Now you just have to pay the party, and then you can qualify to the chair, so that drives the rest of you into the same pockets. The Republicans stopped even pretending to be a political party about 20 years ago or so. Now they're just totally enthralled to the 1/10 of 1%. One of the reasons the Republican debates are such a total farce is that in order to mobilize voters, they can't come to voters with their actual policies. Nobody would vote for them. So they have to appeal to pretty unpleasant tendencies in the population that have always been there, but are now mobilized, and you get the picture you see there. I won't go through it. The world can't believe what they're seeing. But it's a natural result of the fact that the party essentially abandoned any pretense of being a parliamentary party in the normal sense, and is just driven into the service of the fraction of 1%. The Democrats aren't that far behind. I mean, the Democrats are what used to be called moderate Republicans. They've all been kicked out of the party. In fact, if you look, somebody like, say, Eisenhower would be considered a radical leftist in the current spectrum. Nixon, pretty much on the left. Even Reagan would be more or less on the left. But and those are changes that have taken place since the 70s, particularly 80s. Well, one consequence, another aspect of this was deregulation. Another, which of course led predictably to repeatable crashes ever since the Reagan years. And another element was changes in corporate governance, rules of corporate governance. So, for example, by now, in fact, for the last 30 years, a CEO can effectively choose the board that grants him salary and stock options. Well, you can predict what's going to happen from that. So now if you compare, say, the United States and Europe, pretty similar societies, the ratio of pay to top management as compared with workers is far higher here than in comparable societies, and not because they're more talented, as maybe David Brooks will tell you, and so on, or because they perform any services. In fact, they mostly probably harm the economy, but just because, if you tell people you can pick your own salary, well, okay. So yes, that's a big problem. And if the United States were to, say, just to return to what it was, nothing very utopian, or to be like other industrial societies, it was not a very good model, but certainly not utopian, then this vast chasm between top remuneration and the workforce would sharply shrink. But my feeling is that's nowhere near enough. We ought to have as an ideal, at least, the traditional left ideal. There's kind of a conception of work that underlies this. There are different conceptions of what work is. This comes right out of the debates during the Enlightenment. One conception is work is something that you have to be driven to. You wouldn't do it unless you were forced by starvation. It's something you hate, but you have to do because you can't live otherwise. That's basically the capitalist conception of work. There's another conception which says work is the highest ideal in life. Free, creative work under your own control is exactly what any human being would choose if they could. And there are places where that ideal is practiced. Like if you walk down the halls at MIT, you'll find people working, maybe 80 hours a week. They could make a lot more money in the stock market, but they're doing it because they love it. You have things you'd like to do. I know carpenters who are the same way. In their spare time, they go out in the shed and make interesting, good things. It's what they like to do. That's a different conception of work. Now, if under the second conception, basically the Enlightenment conception, there's no reason why that pay should relate to the amount of work you do. It has nothing to do with it. You do the work even if you aren't being paid. If the work is under your own control, under your own choice. I mean, a kind of a graphic Enlightenment image of this, actually, by one of the founders of classical liberalism, Wilhelm von Humboldt, was that if an artisan produces a beautiful object on command, we admire what he did, but we despise what he is, namely a tool in the hands of others. On the other hand, if he creates it under his own will and choice, and out of his own concerns and interests, we admire what he did and who he is. Actually, Adam Smith said pretty similar things. These are traditional conservative ideas, if the word conservative has any meaning. But the capitalist conception is quite different. You work only under a lash, and therefore those who allegedly work harder, actually they don't. They should get, multi-million-dollar stock options. But these are just extremely different conceptions, and they lead to all sorts of different ideas about how a society ought to be organized.
You have written, Noam, that slavery, the oppression of women and working people, and other severe violations of human rights have been able to endure in part because, in various ways, the values of the oppressors have been internalized by the victims. That is why consciousness raising is often the first step in liberation. What do you think are the most important ways to raise consciousness, to free us from the values of the oppressors that are stuck inside us?
I should say that, again, I don't take any credit for that view. It's a very old one.
Right.
You can read David Hume, for example, another one of the founders of classical liberalism, great philosopher, wrote on foundations of government, and he said the first principle of government, he said, is something that strikes him when he looks at history. He was also a historian, that he's struck by the easiness with which the governed accept the rule of the governors. And he says this is paradoxical because power is in the hands of the governed. Power is not in the hands of the rulers. So how is this miracle maintained? Well, he says it's by control of opinion. If the governors can control opinion and attitude, then impose what later was called false consciousness that you were describing, then they can rule. But if you can break that, then they're gone. They can't stand up against the governed. So how do you break it? Well, all the ways we know. So, say, take slavery. I mean, first of all, there was never a peaceful period of slavery. There were always slave revolts. The slave families found their own ways of constructing islands of freedom within the sadistic society that they were part of, and occasionally these led to actual major revolts, which were violently crushed. Finally, it led to, after far too long, of course, it did lead to abolitionism and formal elimination of slavery, though we should note formal, because, in fact, in many ways it still remains. The Civil War, technically, amendments, constitutional amendments during the Civil War did, in fact, formally end slavery, but it was reconstituted about 10 years later by criminalization of black life, North-South Compact, which essentially reconstituted it. And now it's we're going through something like that now. Take a look at the incarceration rate. But take, say, women's rights. well, that's that of course also goes far back, but it didn't really become a substantial movement until the 1970s. There were germs of it in the 60s and 60s activism, but and the way it began was small consciousness-raising groups, groups of women talking to each other and they're trying to break through the general assumption that this is the way it has to be. There are no choices. Women are supposed to be property. In fact, if you look at American law, the women remained essentially property well into the 1970s. Some ways still are. I mean, there was no legal right for women to serve on juries until 1975, Supreme Court judgment. Well, you know, it developed mostly among women. It was a big crisis inside the activist movements, incidentally, in the 60s, when young men who were doing very courageous things like resistance had to somehow face the fact that they too are oppressors. That was difficult. It actually led to suicide in some cases, but it's a hard thing to deal with. But slowly it spread through much of the society, and now a lot of it's just taken for granted. Not everywhere, but no, not Rick Santorum, but quite broadly. And that's the way things change. It was the same with workers' rights and everything else. There's no magic. We know how to do it. It's just a matter of doing it.
I live in Venezuela. Do you have any message for the people of Latin America and the Caribbean who are trying to free themselves from domination by the United States?
Well, what's happened in the last decade south of the border is pretty spectacular. It's of real historic importance. If you think over history, for 500 years, Latin America was dominated overwhelmingly. Internationally, it was dominated by imperial powers. The first European powers and the United States. Internally, there was a reflection of that. The typical Latin American society had a small, super wealthy elite, 1% if you like, mostly Europeanized, often white. They concentrated the wealth of the society, the tremendous misery and oppression, in pretty rich societies that should be quite wealthy. And the ruling elites were Western-oriented. Their capital flowed to the West. They didn't invest it at home. They imported luxury goods. The children went to colleges in Europe and the United States. They had second homes on the Riviera, that kind of thing. So they're basically a European, including the U.S., I don't know word for it, but a Western implant inside their own societies, ruling it very brutally. Well, and the countries were separated from one another. They didn't have roads connecting each other. They were just oriented to the West and the U.S. Well, that's changed in the last 10 years. This half a millennium pattern is changing radically. The countries are beginning to integrate. That's a prerequisite for independence. They've beginning to face some of their internal problems, which are very severe, at doing it in different ways in different countries, but it's happening throughout the continent. The indigenous movements, which are the most repressed part of the population, those who survived, have gained considerable both organization and even power. In Bolivia, they run the government. In Ecuador, they're a strong part of the social political order, conflicts with the government, but fighting for their own interests. And all of these changes are very important. In fact, they may save the planet. Around the world, whether it's Australia or Latin America or anywhere else, the indigenous movements are in the forefront of trying to do something to save the planet, the human species, from self-destruction. In Bolivia and Ecuador, the two countries with the strongest indigenous movements, there's now legislation in Ecuador, I think it's in the Constitution, for what's called rights of nature.
Right.
And these are traditional parts of indigenous culture, just totally marginalized by industrialization. And unless that consciousness spreads, we're all doomed. So both for themselves and for the world, some very striking things have happened. I mean, the U.S. used to take Latin America completely for granted. It was called our little region over here, which
Backyard.
yeah, our backyard, and it was taken for granted. Unless we can control Latin America, we can't control the rest of the world. In fact, that was stated repeatedly. All right, the U.S. has lost it. Not all of it, but South America, for example, there isn't a single U.S. military base left, which is a pretty significant fact. Now, the U.S. isn't giving up. So the training of Latin American officers has increased. They're being trained to combat what's called radical populism, which means, troublesome priests who organize peasants, human rights activists, and so on. We know how that works in Latin America. The most interesting case right now is Colombia. That was the last holdout for the United States in South America. The U.S. Bush and Obama tried to get control of at least access to 7 military bases in Colombia. And there was a lot of furor about that on the continent, a lot of protest. Well, the Colombian Constitutional Court blocked it. But the U.S. is still constructing the bases. So they are evidently hoping that they can somehow overrule the rulings of the court and get them through. And there's a significant confrontation going on in Colombia about the legacy of the U.S. domination, which was pretty monstrous there. Central America and the Caribbean are much weaker societies. And
Smaller.
Small, weak, separated. And there it's easier, though not totally easy anymore, to control them. So the coup in Honduras, which the U.S. backed, it claimed not to back it, but effectively ended up backing it, I'm pretty sure is related to the fact that Honduras is one of the countries where there are major U.S. military bases. The Palmarola Air Base, for one, was the main base for supporting the Contras, for example. And there are a number of American bases, U.S. bases spread all through that region, and also in the Caribbean islands, the Dutch islands, and so on. But it's not the direction things are going. So one significant move, at least symbolically, was the formation, I think it was last summer, finally, the first meeting in Caracas of CELAC, an organization which includes every country of the Western Hemisphere, except for the United States and Canada. And that's, at least symbolically, very significant. If it becomes a functioning organization, its intention, I presume, is to replace the OAS, Organization of American States, which is U.S. dominated. And it includes Cuba, excludes the United States and Canada. Well, if all of these things are in the same direction, they're a move towards dismantling the system of external control and internal domination. Both are proceeding in parallel, and they're both very significant.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. The viral growth of the Occupy movement and the public support of it is testament to the tremendous dissatisfaction with the inequities and abuses of corporate capitalism. The slogan, "We are the 99%," is resonating with many people. What is your view of the potential strength of this type of mass protest and its possibility to affect social change?
Well, the Occupy movement already has had a number of significant successes. One of them, as you say, is to kind of change the national discourse. These concerns and fears and so on were, of course, prevalent for a long time for perfectly objective reasons, having to do with changes in the socioeconomic system in the last 30 or 40 years. But they weren't crystallized very clearly until the Occupy movement put them forward. And now they're kind of common coin. So 99% time, probably the period of the greatest free press in the United States. All kinds of press, ethnic, labor, anything. And the labor press, which was extremely interesting and lively and participatory, had a great many harsh criticisms of the industrial system that was being imposed, into which people were being driven. But one of the core criticisms was what 150 years ago they called the new spirit of the age. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self, which they considered, savage and inhuman, and it was being driven into their heads. Well, 150 years later, they're still trying to drive it into people's heads. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self. And now it's considered a kind of an ideal, but it's also intolerable to human beings. One effect of the Occupy movement has been simply to spontaneously create small social systems of solidarity, mutual support, cooperation, cooperative kitchens, libraries, health services, general assemblies in which people actually interact and so on. That's something very much missing in the society. And
local economies are run. It's the responsibility of all levels of government to promote policies that achieve full employment. Do you think that economic democracy and local economies could move us forward?
Well, first of all, this is the traditional stand of the left. So if you go back again 150 years ago to these same newspapers I was mentioning, one of their demands was that those who work in the mills should own them and, of course, manage them. That was the slogan of the Knights of Labor, the major, huge labor organization that developed in the 19th century. European socialism was mostly, had several branches, but the more left branches, if you like, were essentially the same, committed to workers' councils, community organizations, guild socialism in England was the same. This is the traditional thrust of the socialist movement. It's not understood here because, as I said again, this is a very business-run society. You're not allowed to know any of these things. So socialism is some kind of bad word, Well, okay, that's what happens in a highly controlled society, a highly indoctrinated society. But these are very familiar goals, and yes, in fact, they're 1%, the radical equality, the farcical character of purchased elections, the corporate shenanigans that led to the current crisis and have been crushing people for a long time, the overseas wars and so on. What are that's one major contribution. The other one is not discussed so much, but I think it's pretty important. This is an extremely atomized society. People are alone. It's a very business-run society, and the very explicit goal of the business world is to create a social order in which the basic social unit is you and your television set, in which you're watching ads and going out to purchase commodities. And there's tremendous efforts made it's going on for a century and a half, to try to induce this kind of consciousness and social order. In fact, if you go back, say, 150 years, the early days of the Industrial Revolution, right here in Massachusetts, where it started, there was very lively press at the time. When we talk about potential, part of the potential would be to, first of all, maintain those bonds and associations after the tactic has outlived its usefulness, and tactics do outlive their usefulness. But after that happens, if what has been learned and internalized can be sustained and extended, that would be very important in itself. The other dimension is how much can you engage the rest of the so-called 99% in these activities, concerns, interactions, and so on. That's the next big step that has to be taken.
Many in the Occupy movement have realized that political democracy is controlled by big money. Few, however, have expressed that economic democracy is essential for a truly democratic society. The progressive utilization theory, or PROUD, advocates economic democracy to empower people and communities through cooperative management of most enterprises. Economic democracy requires that the minimum requirements of life be guaranteed to everyone, and decision-making be decentralized so people have the right to choose how their local